Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this very special event. We welcome, first of all, Amir Tibon and his wife, the first time they come to Vienna for this evening. Thank you for coming, Amir. Our moderator, Tessa Szyszkowitz, will of course introduce Amir, senior correspondent and journalist of Ha'aretz in greater detail. I have the honor and the pleasure to welcome you here on a very special occasion, a very special time, on your awarded book, also The Gates of Gaza, which you can after this evening, of course, buy and also get signed here in the front door. So take this opportunity. Let me, before we come to the present or the recent present, let me say that I learned that the great grandfather of Amir, he fled Germany in the 1930s to the then British mandate territory, Palestine. So your family actually is rooted in our very troubled history as well. And because of that, but also because of the current discussions we have in our society, we will take, or we have invited and have the pleasure to take Amir Tibon tomorrow to a place that is also connected to the Kreisky Forum. This is the high school at Karajangasse 14, where Bruno Kreisky was incarcerated on the 15th of March 1938. Karajangasse, that is today a high school with a small museum and a place of remembrance, was a school turned into a prison in the 30s. So, and Kreisky was actually supposed to be deported to Dachau from that school. In our, whatever we will hear and listen to you this evening, for us it's also important to bring the knowledge, the experience, and also, of course, the discussion that goes together with the situation we see in Israel and Palestine, but also that we still remember and have to face due to our history. So the Kreisky Forum's intention is to bring all that to schools, to also make it available for the younger generations, even more important. So when we see the developments in our society of today. So, having said that, it's also for us a great pleasure and honor to cooperate with the Director of Education, Wiener Bildungsdirektion, on this issue, and we're glad that you accepted to go there. Having said all that, and giving a kind of a frame from your father's history to what we actually hope also to achieve in our activities, I leave the floor now to your very special story and your current and very well-known efforts to enlighten us also about the struggles you have in Israel for a different Israel also, for in a very different and difficult situation, and also in relation, and we are looking forward to hear from you, to get a glimpse into the future and the perspective of what we can expect in the basically coexistence and also cooperation with Palestine and the Palestinians. Thank you very much, and I wish you an interesting evening. Thank you, Tessa.
Thank you, Sabine. When Amir and I planned this visit, we were thinking about what date to take. And when he could get away from work and come with Miri, who is also here, to Vienna, and then we looked and said, we're not even sure if there are planes flying from Ben Gurion Airport to Schwechat, Vienna. And that is even for the history of Israel and Austria, a special moment in time. So I'm very happy that we managed to bring you here. They had to get up this morning at 3 o'clock in the morning. So if Amir falls asleep in the middle, you know why. Don't hold it against him.
Don't worry, not going to happen.
So, of course, it is a tragic event that brings us together. When October 7th happened, I think most people here in the hall had a really difficult day watching the events and hearing, understanding how terrible it is. But of course, you had the most terrible day that you could possibly have. So we have to understand that Amir Tibon, who grew up in the north of Israel, but decided when he met Miri to get married and move to a kibbutz outside of the Gaza Strip, Nahal Oz. Nahal Oz, as we will also discuss a little bit later on, which is part of the book, was established to bring together the agricultural attempts of making Israel a successful country in an economy, and also sort of establish the land as a livable environment, but also in combination, of course, to make clear that this is the land of Israel and not the land of the Palestinians, who were living very close behind the armistice line when the country was established. So there was from the beginning, of course, quite a difficult situation that the kibbutz found itself in. But the family of Amir and Miri, with their 2 daughters, on the morning of October 7th, realized that all the normal danger that you've been living in was suddenly eclipsed by what was happening in that morning hours. So if you can bear it, and I think it's also important to understand how this day developed for you and how you realized that you were in absolutely horrifying danger for the life of you, your wife, and the children. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it.
Yes. It's important to understand that when we made a decision in the year 2014 to move from Tel Aviv, where we were living at the time, to Nahal Oz, a small kibbutz, an agricultural community on the border with Gaza, we knew that certain risks were associated with this move, because Nahal Oz is so uniquely close to Gaza. It's only 700 meters from the border fence, and behind that border fence is Gaza City's easternmost neighborhood, Sajaiya. So over there, Iron Dome does not exist. When you live in a community so close to Gaza, the Iron Dome system that allows life in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem to continue as normal does not offer you protection at times of war. And there were other risks over the years. For example, there was a phenomenon that cars driving the roads on the Israeli side of the border were targeted from inside Gaza. At one time, even a threat of anti-tank missiles being fired at such cars. And families that choose to live in this part of Israel, on the border with Gaza, know that these are the risks associated with life in that part of the country. And people, for various reasons that I describe and explain in the book, still choose to live there. For ideological reasons, because they believe in the importance of upholding the borders of Israel, because they believe in the importance of the kibbutz movement and of living a communal way of life, because they believe in the importance of holding on to the land. Nahal Oz and all the other communities that were attacked on October 7 are not settlements sitting on disputed or occupied lands. They are part of the state of Israel. They are on our side of the border that has existed since the 1949 armistice and was later, kind of officialized in the Oslo Accords. And for all of these reasons, and also for more, I would say, down-to-earth reasons, people searching for a community to belong to, quality of life. I know it sounds crazy, what quality of life on a war-torn border, but yes, if you come to visit Nahal Oz and Be'eri and Kfar Aza and these other communities you may have heard of in the news over the past year, you will see that they are beautiful and surrounded by vast open fields and nature. So people choose to live in these places for all of those reasons and more. And yet, what happened on the morning of October 7 was a risk that no family would have taken if they knew ahead of time that it could happen. Because the missiles that fall on these communities from time to time and you have no Iron Dome to protect you, this is something people had grown used to. And the fact that when a siren goes off in Tel Aviv, you have 90 seconds to reach shelter. But when a siren goes off in Nahal Oz, indicating a mortar being fired from Gaza, you have 7 seconds to reach shelter. This is something people have grown used to. Sad, but after so many years of war, this is the reality. But you can never grow used to the idea of armed terrorists infiltrating your own community and simply going from door to door and looking for families to slaughter and kidnap, which is what happened on that morning. We awoke at 6:30 a.m. from the whistle of a mortar that was about to fall on our neighborhood. Well, I say we, it's not fair. Miri actually was the first one to wake up from the mortar. I was still sleeping and the whistle somehow interjected my dream and she kind of elbowed me. I'll be careful for the glass of water here, but she elbowed me, said, Amir, there's a mortar. There was no siren. I don't know why until now. And we ran to the room of the house which we call the safe room. This is a room built of thick concrete, and every home in these border communities in southern Israel has a room like that, because that room is supposed to protect you even if your house is directly hit by a mortar or a rocket from Gaza. You close the heavy metal door of that room, and there's a metal plate connected to the wall with which you can cover the window, and once you do that, you are safe inside. Even if a rocket will fall in your living room, you are supposed to stay alive. And most families that live in the border area turn that room into the children's bedroom. Because think about it, 7 seconds to reach shelter, only one room in the house is really secure if you are hit. So the most sensible thing to do is to make that room the bedroom of your children. Because then if there's a siren at 6:30 in the morning and you have to run, well, at least the parents run to the children and not the other way around, which is what we did that morning. We ran to the girls' bedroom. They continued to sleep. They didn't wake up from the noises and the explosions. And we kind of got our breath together. And we checked on our phones that all of our neighbors and friends in our little neighborhood of the kibbutz, a lot of young families, everybody's okay. And then we started packing because we thought, okay, another round of fighting between Israel and Hamas has just begun. Over the years that we have lived in Nahal Oz, we moved there in 2014, there have been many of these rounds of fighting, and they have their own cycle of life. It begins with Israel killing some Hamas or Islamic Jihad leader in Gaza, or with Hamas firing rockets into Israel. And then for a few days, there's this back and forth of the two sides bombarding each other. And after a week, maybe 2 weeks, the Prime Minister goes on television with a very determined face. And he says, this time we really showed them and they'll never mess with us again. And then half a year later, it starts all over again. So we thought another one of those. And you probably read about them in the news, right? Every half a year or so, there's this week of fighting between Israel and Gaza. That's what we expected. So naturally, we started packing in the dark. We have a procedure for this. This is not improvised. We know that when a round of fighting with Hamas begins, all the young families leave the kibbutz. You don't want to be there with young children when there are dozens and hundreds of rockets falling on the community and you have 7 seconds to reach shelter. Children cannot go to school like this. They cannot go to daycare. There's nothing for them to do. So we started packing. We have under the beds of our 2 girls who are now sleeping in the dark with the explosions around them. Each one of them had a suitcase under her bed. We take the suitcase, we put some clothes in it, we wait for the mortars to stop. They have to stop because you have to reload them at some point, okay? It takes a few minutes. And then we shove them in the car and we drive away from the community, and all of our friends do the same. But on that morning, we realized very soon we will not be able to do it for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, there was no pause in the mortar and rocket launches. It was just on and on and on. And reason number 2, because at some point we began to hear automatic gunfire. And as I explain in the book, Nahal Oz, which is the closest Israeli community to Gaza, has always endured certain security risks ever since its creation in October 1953. The first mortar was fired toward the kibbutz already in the 1950s, just to give perspective. But throughout the 70-year history of this border community, and think about all the wars that we experienced during those 70 years, all the conflicts, all the ups and downs of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and the negative, of that peace process, which is the war reality. Throughout this 70-year history, one thing never ever happened. An armed terrorist from Gaza never entered this kibbutz. So you can imagine that when we began to hear gunfire, we were very confused. Because one of the things about unprecedented historical events is that they never happened before. So you cannot imagine them happening. And we could not imagine terrorists inside Nahal Oz. Never happened before. Mortars, rockets, missiles, okay, but why are we hearing gunfire? And by 7:15 a.m., our own house was surrounded by a group of terrorists. We were inside the safe room. The door was locked of the house, not of the room. The door of the house was locked. And they were trying to break in, firing through the windows of the house into our living room. By the way, on the door was a baby stroller, because we are locked in there with 2 young girls. Our oldest daughter was 3.5 years old at the time, and our younger was 1 year and 9 months old. And the terrorists, they had cameras on their heads, like GoPro cameras. And we eventually, after some time, got access to some of the self-documentation that they made that morning, and you see them firing into the house with the baby stroller in the background. This is how the day began.
It's just, if you read it, it's just so incredible to think that you were discussing how can you tell your daughters to shut up. Everyone who has a child here in the room knows if a 1.5-year-old person decides that they want to drink milk, they want to drink it now, and they might scream if you don't give them. The
one thing a child never does is shut up when you tell them to.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean, this is just not...
So how did you manage to make them understand that they had to be quiet?
I give most of the credit to Miri, who's sitting here in the front row. She, in a very soothing but determined voice, simply explained to the girls the situation in words that were appropriate for their age. We did not begin a geopolitical history course about why are these men standing outside our house trying to murder us, because this was not going to help and we didn't have time anyway. But she said, and I explain in the book, she told them why they have to be quiet right now, what are these noises that we are hearing, and she also offered things that the girls could do. Not only you have to be quiet, but also what can be done. You can hug your doll, you can sleep a little more in bed, you can cuddle with your blanket. She offered some positive and not just negative. And I also think there may have been some kind of a surviving instinct at work that, with her guidance, went into the right kind of reaction. but they understood in a very, very basic level that their parents were not telling them to be quiet now just for the sake of it, but that there was actually a reason behind this request.
What we have to understand also is that Amir doesn't only live in a kibbutz and works in the fields, but he is also at that point the diplomatic correspondent of Ha'aretz. So what does a journalist do first thing when you want to understand what's happening? I mean, everyone, not only journalists, you would take your telephone and have a look, not only at the WhatsApp groups of the neighborhood, but also call your colleagues and ask what's going on.
Yes. The first person I spoke to on that morning was my colleague from the newspaper, Amos Harel, the best defense analyst in Israel. And I actually write in the book that Miri and I had this habit that, Amos is a close personal friend. Whenever there was some concern that things could heat up between Israel and Gaza, for example, a Hamas leader made a public threat to attack Israel. Or Itamar Ben-Gvir, our now former, we'll see how much that holds, but for now, our former police minister would do some provocation, because he's a far-right provocateur who should have no role in government, and yet, these are the times we live in. Whenever he would do something really stupid, so Miri would tell me, you need to call Amos Harel right now and ask him if this is going to escalate into a full-blown war. And I told her, Miri, there is Amos the prophet in the Bible. Amos, my friend, is not a prophet, but still we would call him. And that morning, when the whole thing started, I also called him. I said, Amos, what's going on? And he was the first one to tell me that there are actually reports of some kind of an infiltration of the Israeli border from Gaza. But even after he told me this, and I don't think he thought differently, I did not imagine that it would be an invasion of an army, which is eventually what happened on October 7. Israel was invaded by an army of terrorists. When he said infiltration, I thought to myself, 5 or 7 terrorists are going to emerge from a tunnel somewhere on the Israeli side of the border, and they will try to kill or kidnap soldiers on the border. I did not imagine, and Amos did not, I think, either, that we will be experiencing an invasion of more than 3,000 Hamas fighters into Israel, later accompanied by a second and third wave of Gazan citizens who themselves cross the border, which was completely open by that point, and go into the kibbutzim on the border in order to loot and steal. This was not in the cards, but still, he was the first one who alerted me to the very possibility of something different happening this time.
So it was clear for you that you would stay in the house, in your room, choice. And not...
Yeah.
But then, and that of course is another almost incredible story, how you waiting for Israeli soldiers, the army showing up and saving the civilians, but who actually came was not only the army, and it took a long time, but it was your own father.
Yes, this is one of the main themes of the book, not the only one, but one of the main themes is the family story, because when I sat down to write this book, what I wanted to do was to tell the personal family story of what happened to our family on that day, to tell the broader story of my community on that day, the different people who were murdered and kidnapped and who fought in defense of the community, and then the history of the kibbutz. What is this place, Nahal Oz? Why is it situated there on the border? How did it get there, and the relationship with Gaza? The family story is a story that just on its own, without the context of the history and the community, would be like, people would say, oh, this is like the craziest story, like a thriller story, but it's true. My parents were both 62 years old. They live in Tel Aviv. They were swimming in the beach that morning. That is a religious activity for Tel Aviv residents on Saturday morning. And the alerts of the rockets began in Tel Aviv, and they at some point got out of the water. Not immediately, by the way. The first few sirens, they continued swimming. But at some point, they became a bit worried about us down in the kibbutz, so they went to check their phones, and this is when we updated them that terrorists have infiltrated the community. And my father, who is a retired general in the Israeli army, he finished his service in 2014, actually around the same time we had moved to Nahal Oz. He tried to call all the top people at the military. You know, he knows the chief of staff and the head of the Southern Command, but nobody answered. He called them and they did not answer their phones. And he messaged them, there are terrorists in Nahal Oz, and they didn't answer. And then my parents took a very unusual decision to basically drive down to Nahal Oz themselves. My father wanted to go alone. He just took his pistol and wanted to get into the car and drive. And my mother, in a moment of pure genius, said, you need two available hands, one with the gun and one with the phone, to try calling and texting people. So let me drive for you. And that was a very important decision that ended up saving the lives of several people on October 7, and I tell the story in the book, but my mother, the fact that she was there saved the lives of at least 3 Israeli soldiers who were injured and that she ended up taking to the hospital under fire. And this is a story of heroism, one of many stories of heroism contained in the pages of the book, of different people. But what I always say about the stories of heroism that are in this book is that all of them are also a mirror to the dysfunction and the failure. Because where do you need heroes? Where things don't work properly. Right? If things work properly, there's no need for heroes. Nobody needs to save the day. It's when the systems collapse and don't function that people have to step up and risk their lives. And some of the heroes I write about in this book, one of them my next door neighbor, another police fighter who died very close to my house, you know, some of them did not survive their acts of heroism. Because when things collapse, it becomes very dangerous to be a hero.
Of course, I mean, also for your father, a crazy idea to drive into not only a war zone, but a chaos of an ongoing attack with completely, you know, let loose people running around. You didn't even know who's fighting who, also because it wasn't clear who they were. So for him to go in, to save you, to come into a kibbutz where there was really no clear presence of an army that could make order or tell him where to help, was basically a suicide mission in order to save you.
Well, you know, some people who came from their homes on that day to try to save people, it was actually, you know, they died fighting. And for my parents, it was very close on at least one occasion. This is the story of October 7. You know, a few weeks ago, Miri and I were invited to some panel about books that were published in Israel about October 7. It was in Jerusalem, it was a very nice event, and I was on the stage with 2 other authors. And there was a lot of discussion about stories of heroism that happened on October 7, and there are countless stories of heroism. And somebody from the crowd got up and said, I want to thank the 3 of you for writing these books, because we learned through them that there were more stories of courage and heroism than stories of horror and helplessness. And I had to politely interject and say that's not true. There were many, many, many stories of courage and heroism, and all of them should be told, and I made my effort in this book to tell some of those stories as they are part of the, you know, plot line of Nahal Oz. But unfortunately, there were many, many more stories of helplessness and a very, very grim situation for so many people.
Well, at the end of that very long day, you could hear suddenly outside of the window, not the Palestinian the fighters, terrorists talking there, but you heard Hebrew and you heard your father's voice.
Yes, this is you know, one of the dramatic moments of the day. We were locked in the room from 6:30 in the morning until almost 4 p.m. There was no electricity. The electricity fell down at 6:45 in the morning. We had no food, so the girls had nothing to eat. Miri had the, smart moment that she went out for 2 minutes and brought some water into the room right before the gunfire began, which was a big thing that she did, because we would have had a very different situation if we did not have water. But you have to understand that the darkness that I refer to in this room, this is not like a dark room. The safe rooms are built to protect you from tiny pieces of shrapnel. So that, let's say a rocket falls on your house, even the tiniest piece of shrapnel from the explosion can kill you. So it has to block the tiniest little pieces, which means that once you close that door and you cover that window, there is zero infiltration of air or light from outside. Zero. Any source of light has to be from inside the room. And when you're in such a safe room and there's no electricity, and you run out of your phone battery, you basically find yourself in complete darkness. Yeah. We all know and love the Leonard Cohen song, where he says there is a crack in everything. That's how the light comes in. But apparently it's not true. Sometimes there is no crack. And so we were sitting there and we were waiting. We were in the dark, literally and figuratively, because once the phones ran out of battery, we couldn't know what was happening outside. Until close to 4 p.m., we heard a knock on the window and we heard my father's voice. And we realized he had made it, because he told us in the morning that they were coming from Tel Aviv, my parents. Along the way they had to split. My mother took the injured soldiers to the hospital and he continued, but he made it eventually. And then there was a very sudden shift from a situation where we were alone in the dark to a situation where our house became a place of refuge for many other families, because the soldiers that eventually arrived and that my father had joined in searching the kibbutz for terrorists and for survivors, they had a method. In each neighborhood, after they would finish scanning the houses and engaging the terrorists and finding the families, in each neighborhood, they would choose one home and concentrate as many neighbors as they could under one roof. And in our neighborhood, they chose our house, which made sense. I mean, my father was there. They had known him by then because they fought together, and they started bringing all the neighbors over. And I have to say, those were actually, for me, I don't know if Miri agrees, but for me, those were the most difficult hours of October 7. Our life was no longer in immediate grave danger. We were no longer in complete darkness. We had food, because we had brought food from the kitchen. We could go to the bathroom. So it was not anymore this immediate, although it was still dangerous, there was still gunfire and explosions, but it was not an immediate grave danger. But the weight of that day began to sit on our shoulders with every family that arrived. Because you have, an 80-year-old neighbor in the house behind that arrives to our house completely injured. All his hand is bleeding and he's receiving treatment in our living room. And his wife is not with him. So you look at his hand and you understand that she's not there, and you don't need to ask anything. And we have a family that lives next door to us, where the father, I write about him a lot in the book, Ilan Fiorentino, my next door neighbor, the security chief of the kibbutz. In each of these communities, there's this little security team that's supposed to be first responders in case of emergency. And he was the leader of that team in our kibbutz. And in the afternoon hours, the soldiers brought his wife and 3 daughters to our home without him. And all the scenarios begin to run in your mind. What happened to him? Where is he? Those were very difficult hours. It was a moment of great excitement that we were saved and we are now together. And it was then followed by some very, very dark hours.
Well, and we are now almost 1.5 years after this event.
Hard to believe, 16 months.
16 months.
Can I say something about
Yeah.
that before you
Yes.
ask the question? This is something I've been saying a lot recently. In Israel's War of Independence in 1948, the last prisoners of war taken by the Egyptians and the Jordanians returned to Israel after 8 months. Now we have hostages, prisoners of war, people who were kidnapped, civilians from their homes, who have been held in unbelievable conditions for 16 months. This is double the amount of time from the prisoners of war of 1948. And Israel was a much weaker country, supposedly, in 1948 than it is today.
So the tragedy is that although you were at least lucky enough to survive, you have a lot of people died on the day, 1,200 Israelis, 250 were taken into Gaza. There's still 76 in Gaza. We don't know how many are alive. We are hoping that 3 will be released on Saturday again. But of course, there's also the other side of the story where Gaza is destroyed after a war that also is only paused now. Nobody knows if it flares up in the next days. 48,000 Palestinians have been killed, a lot of women and children among them. The situation of the internally displaced Palestinian civilian population is unclear. Can they go home, coming back to houses that are destroyed? There's not enough food, there's disease, there's not enough medical equipment. And especially, there is no clear plan for a better future.
There's no future.
Yeah.
This is the issue. We don't know what is the future.
So if we now think that we have an American administration that wants to create one should not even repeat.
No, Monaco on the Middle East.
Yeah, the Riviera on the Middle East. It's so cynical, the entire thing, plan or intention also. But if we look at the political options that we have now, you wrote in Ha'aretz also an article a few days ago when it wasn't even clear if this next phase of the exchange on Saturday happens.
Yeah.
But you said there are 3 scenarios for this immediate future. Maybe you can sort of tell us what you think is the most likely of these, what they are and what the most likely is.
First of all, I want to say that October 7 is the biggest trauma in the history of the State of Israel. And it's a day that is not over yet. Today, it is February 13. But for us, you know, I can speak on behalf of Miri and myself, but also many other people in Israel, it is still October 7 because of the unsolved problem of the hostages. We still have 2 friends from our kibbutz, Omri Miran and Tzachi Idan, both of them fathers of young children who were kidnapped in front of the eyes of their children on October 7, still held by Hamas, almost 500 days now. Until they return to their families, we are not going to be able to switch to October 8. How can you? So, you know, we live our life, okay? We work, and we travel, and we do things with our children, but we have not really had a moment of sheer joy and happiness like we used to have before, because it's like something that sits on your shoulders all day. And you enjoy things in life. I don't want to make martyrs out of us, but it sits on you all the time. And it has to be resolved. It has to be resolved. Now, I see, you know, 2 big scenarios emerging for the potential future now. Scenario number 1 is that the hostage ceasefire deal that was reached last month continues and survives. More hostages are released, more humanitarian aid flows into Gaza. People don't die, not in Gaza, not in Israel. You know, the last months, for the first time, we don't have every day in Israel names of soldiers who are killed, and you don't have on the Palestinian side every day reports of people who are killed in bombardments. I mean, this is already a huge difference. The war ends, and then the battle shifts from the battlefield to the diplomatic field. Because Israel will not just say, okay, the war is over, we are now allowing Hamas to take over Gaza again and rebuild the place. There will be a diplomatic battle waged over the future of Gaza. I don't think Donald Trump's plan to turn Gaza into his own real estate will be a big part of that battle. I don't think, maybe I'm wrong. I think Hamas will want to entrench itself in power, even if that means no reconstruction for Gaza, no rebuilding of homes. That scenario, by the way, would ironically strengthen the chances of Trump's plan. If Hamas entrenches itself in Gaza, there will be no reconstruction. Why? Well, ask yourself, which government will put millions and billions of dollars into Gaza, knowing that Hamas remains in power, and 3 years from now, there could be another war, and all the homes that you will now rebuild will be destroyed again? Which government has the money to do that today? We are in difficult times, financially, fiscally. A lot of countries are actually cutting back on foreign aid. The Arab kingdoms are not looking at the internal flow of oil money. Nobody has a few billions to burn at this moment. So if Hamas remains in power, there will be no reconstruction, which brings the question of how do you squeeze them out through diplomatic and economic pressures and replace them with a different Palestinian government that will have the support of Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, and that will be able to work with the United States and Israel. This is the most optimistic scenario. The ceasefire and hostage release deal holds, hostages come out, the war ends, Hamas is squeezed out of power, and Gaza is rebuilt in a different way. Now we have the most pessimistic scenario, which is that the hostage and ceasefire deal collapses. And that could happen tomorrow, it could happen next week. There are strong forces that want this deal to collapse, including within the Israeli government. I've been writing about it every day, really, for the last few weeks, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the far-right elements of his coalition actually want this deal to collapse. Sadly, as an Israeli citizen, I find it shocking because this deal is the last chance we have to bring our people back alive and to bring those who are dead, but their bodies are in captivity, to proper burial. If the war is renewed next week, hostages who are alive today will die. Not maybe, will die. And dead bodies of other hostages could go lost forever. I mean, we have precedents of that in Israel. We have families. Ron Arad is the most famous story. Ron Arad was an Israeli pilot. His plane, Air Force pilot. His plane was hit over Lebanon. He made an emergency landing, and he was kidnapped by Hezbollah, and eventually was murdered in captivity, and his body was never retrieved. Now think about his family, never having closure, never having proper burial, never really knowing for sure that he's actually dead. Now multiply that by 30 families. And each family like that has circles around it of extended family and friends and neighbors. What does that do to a society, small like Israel?
But the price for getting all the hostages back
is to end the war.
And is to end the war, which also means that Hamas will stay in power.
It means that we will actually have to get Hamas out of power through smart diplomacy and economic pressure, and not through just another 6 months of fighting, which, by the way, may not even achieve this goal. We don't know.
Yeah.
But this is the pessimistic scenario, that it collapses, the war is renewed, a lot of more people die, a lot of more suffering. And where does it end? I mean, one of my concerns today, honestly, when I look at the strategic situation, is the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement. If the war is renewed and the far-right forces in Israel view it as an opportunity to push for the Trump plan by simply pushing the population south into Egypt, I'm not sure Egypt does not cancel the peace agreement. These are dangerous moments.
I mean, it would be for sure a long-term instability that it would mean to have 1-2 million Palestinians coming into Egypt. But it's certainly impossible for Egypt diplomatically to then continue having relations with Israel.
The whole premise of the peace agreement is that the Sinai is the territory that Egypt won back as a result of the 1973 war and then the 1978 Camp David agreement. Once you start playing with that, the foundations of the peace agreement become shaky.
Yeah.
And we live in Israel today in a reality where Egypt is a neighbor, not an enemy. We don't want to go back to a reality where that's questionable. This would have profound implications for Israel's military, for our state budget, for so many aspects of life.
And that is only one issue, is Gaza, which of course wouldn't be the end of the story. If you start ethnically cleansing Gaza, direction Egypt, then you have the West Bank where you have 2.8 million Palestinians.
If this happens in Gaza, you will see growing appetite among the far right in Israel to have something similar in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Listen, I really want to believe that we will somehow be able to get into phase 2 of the ceasefire and the war.
So that's scenario 3 is that neither the...
Scenario 3 is kind of like the Netanyahu way, which is, not this and not that, just like the ceasefire will not hold, the war in Gaza will be renewed, but not to the extent that you have, ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and it will just be a terrible situation that will drag on for months with no clear end game. And for Netanyahu, he's a politician that plays on time. He wants to remain in power, he wants to hold to his current coalition. Half a year of this kind of inconclusive war, he'll take it if it means his coalition doesn't fall apart. What I really hope is that the American administration will eventually make the right decision here and push for the ceasefire to be prolonged and for the hostage release to continue, and will then orchestrate a real pressure campaign on Hamas to give up power with all the relevant Arab countries. And again, the reconstruction is a very strong leverage. There will not be any reconstruction of Gaza if Hamas remains in power. Not because this is some kind of threat from Israel or America, because this is the reality of the world. No country will put money into it.
But the problem that this whole debate about who will govern Gaza has is, of course, that it's the way we are talking here now. I mean, I have, as an Austrian citizen, nothing to tell the Palestinians how they are governing themselves. If you think that we are talking again as if they don't have their own right to determine who governs them. So what you're saying is you appeal to the...
They can determine, but if they determine it's Hamas, they have to understand the consequences. No country will put money into reconstructing Gaza as long as Hamas is in power there.
So if you think, you wrote a book also about Mahmoud Abbas,
yes,
who is still the president now of the Palestinian Authority. So if you go into the thinking of the Palestinian side in terms of leadership debate, what would it suggest to you? What will happen? I mean, Abu Mazen is a very, very old man. The Palestinian Authority is very weak. For every reason that we can think of.
Gaza can be the opportunity for new Palestinian leadership to rise. It really can be. because Abbas is a corrupt dictator, let's put it this way, who is very weak politically. He has not won a legitimate election since 2005. He survives today mostly because Israel, it's comfortable for Israel to have him in power there in Ramallah. But in Gaza, you will have a different situation. If indeed there is this Arab coalition that I imagine pressuring Hamas to give up power, there will have to be someone new taking care of the reconstruction process there. And that would be an opportunity to actually have leadership arise. Today we have a crisis of leadership in Israel and a crisis of leadership among the Palestinians. In both sides of the conflict, we talk about solving the conflict. First of all, we have to solve the conflict, the problem of leadership on both sides. I mean, you have a dysfunctional anarchist government in Israel, which is attacking the country's own institutions. And you have a corrupt, weak, I don't want to say illegitimate, but certainly lacking legitimacy government on the Palestinian side. These are very urgent problems that have to be solved regardless of solving the conflict at large.
But I mean, if you look at it, so, you know, we know that in Israel you have functioning democratic institutions, and still there is still no chance that this government, that you even have election.
Functioning institutions, but they are under attack. You know, today, as we speak this evening, a new Chief Justice was sworn in of the Israeli Supreme Court. After a year and a half that we had no Chief Justice because the government refused to do what needs to be done in order to appoint one, and was eventually forced by the court to allow this to happen. And in the ceremony today where the Chief Justice was sworn in, the Prime Minister, the Justice Minister, and the Chairperson of the Knesset boycotted the event. The President of Israel attended, Yitzhak Herzog. He is still someone who puts the value of the state above his own personal politics. But the Prime Minister, Justice Minister, and the Chairman of the Knesset boycotted the event. Okay? I mean,
it's really shocking.
This is what we're dealing with here.
So that means even on the sort of relatively democratic state of Israel you have
democratic under
you have no chance
under
to unseat them at the moment.
Democratic, you know, under attack from the outside, and in a different way under attack from the inside.
Exactly.
This is the reality, and you know, there's another example I want to give. In the history of Israel, we have a mechanism that we call Va'adat Chakira Mamlachtit, a national commission of inquiry. Ever since the 1960s, great tragedies and failures of the state have always been investigated through this mechanism, which is supposed to be independent, but with strong authority. We had a commission like that after the Yom Kippur War. We had a commission like that after Yitzhak Rabin's murder. We had a commission like that more recently after the Meron disaster. This is a civilian disaster that happened a few years ago in Israel, where 45 people died in a stampede in a religious festival in northern Israel. And every time we had a commission that investigated how did this happen, why did this happen, what could be done better next time, who is responsible and needs to step aside. Now, there is no event in the history of Israel that deserves a commission of inquiry like this more than October 7, the biggest failure in the history of the country. 1,200 people were murdered and killed in one day. Entire communities were destroyed. 250 people kidnapped by terrorists into Gaza. I mean, what are we even talking about? And now, 16 months later, where is the commission? Where is the investigation?
Just on Sunday, they postponed again for 3 months.
Government, so there is a fight led by the families who lost their loved ones, demanding such a commission. The government is refusing to do it, and they can veto it. They're refusing to do it because they know that they will be found guilty. Now, they will not be alone. The intelligence agencies, the military, a lot of people share the blame here. There's enough blame to share for everyone in this failure. But they refuse to do it. Now, every passing day, 16 months now, documents can be shredded. Testimonies can be cooked.
So it's becoming more and more
History
difficult.
can be rewritten.
Yeah, of course.
This is what they're doing.
Yeah, and also the longer this government is in power, the more it normalizes talking about just expelling Palestinians into Egypt together with the Trump administration, which is all too happy to support these ideas.
Well, you know, what's happening with the Trump administration is very interesting, I have to say, and it's something that I saw in the first one, but let's take this plan he has for Gaza, for example. So he goes, you know, last week on live TV with Netanyahu by saying, we're going to build this Riviera in Gaza. They're all going to leave. The Palestinians will build amazing homes for them in other countries. They'll be so happy. And Bibi standing next to him. In the beginning, Bibi looks kind of like comfortable with the idea, and he's grinning and he's smiling. Trump just saved his government. Okay. But then 10 minutes later, Trump is asked a question about it, and he says, the United States will own Gaza. Yeah. And then even Netanyahu looks a bit surprised. And you know, I've been covering Netanyahu for many years. I know his body language. He was like, excuse my French, what the fuck did he just say, you know? And Trump says, yeah, it will be American territory. The next day, the White House spokeswoman and Marco Rubio, the secretary, they give interviews and they say, the president meant that the Palestinians will leave temporarily until we build new housing for them, and Gaza will be a different place without Hamas, and they'll be able to return in much safer conditions. Now, this is a very different, version. But 2 days later, he goes again on television and says, no, they will never be able to return because we will build new housing for them. And then in another interview, he says, about Gaza, I will own it. No, not the United States. I will own it. Okay? And then he says, we will send American troops. The next day, no, we will not send American troops. We will buy it. No, the Israelis will give it to us. I mean, there's this whole...
Crazy.
So, I'm not saying don't take it seriously. It is very, very serious. But it's important to understand that nobody knows right now what this plan really is. I mean, what does it actually... And by the way, speaking of the countries that the Palestinians will go to, I mean, Egypt and Jordan have said no. How do you get them to any other country? Because Egypt and Jordan, okay, these are the immediate neighbors. So you can open the border, and some people, I'll tell you, some people will want to live. If tomorrow morning you just open the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt, I believe several hundreds of thousands of Palestinians will move into Egypt.
No.
Because Gaza is completely destroyed. But what do you do with the million who don't want to live?
No, but the whole thing is so utterly cynical because, of course, you can't... somebody sent me the two-state solution under Trump, and you see Israel on the one side and Gaza is the USA. And that is, of course, sort of, from the beginning to the end, this is an impossible thought because it doesn't take the Palestinian population.
We always used to say that Israel is like the 51st state of America, but we didn't think Gaza would beat us to it.
Exactly.
No, listen, so the whole debate, the whole debate is under terms that are based on this partial hallucination. Yeah. The king of Jordan was in the White House this week, and he said, this is not happening. The Egyptian president saw what happened to the king of Jordan and said, you know what, I'm just not going there. I'm just not going. President Sisi just canceled, said, I'm not going to Washington like this. Yeah. There's no point.
But the idea, of course, that Trump has, and a few of the tech bros, and a lot of tech bros in Israel also, is to establish sort of the second part of the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia, sort of bring economic opportunities to a lot of people who can sort of pick it up. Do you think there's any chance that they can, again, go ahead with this over the heads of the Palestinians who will not really be asked?
So the Saudi question is an interesting one. And the question is, do you believe what Saudi Arabia says in public? Because in public...
Well, we have a few examples that the secret ongoings that the Saudis sort of orchestrating are not so pleasant.
In public, the Saudis are against this, very clearly. And they are, you could see this week all of the newspapers there, which are, of course, heavily censored by the government, are staking out a position that Saudi Arabia will not sign a normalization deal with Israel unless there is a Palestinian component to it. The Palestinian component, by the way, is a very humble one. It's not a Palestinian state on the 67 borders. No, it's simply that the Palestinians remain on their land and there is some diplomatic path for statehood for them. This is very humble, but it's too much for the Netanyahu government. So how do you square the circle? But this is what the Saudis are saying publicly. And they're saying it, the Crown Prince said it himself a few months ago. Their foreign minister says it every week. It's in their newspapers. It's in their statements. If their word is meaningless, so supposedly they could sign a deal with Netanyahu and Trump tomorrow. And, there are other elements involved, money, weapons, I don't know. I'm not sure that their word is completely meaningless, though. I think that they are not only saying this, but they are really transmitting it to their own public in a very, very determined way. And the more interesting development is that over the past week, the Saudi media has begun to attack Netanyahu personally. And this is actually a weird story. Netanyahu in Washington gave an interview to what we call Channel 14. This is his propaganda channel in Israel. It's not an interview. He came for a massage, okay? It's like you're watching a person get a massage on live television, basically, okay? But the massage is through questions. So during the massage, the how do you call it? Masseuse, what's the term? Asks him, what about Saudi Arabia? They said there needs to be a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu caught off guard because he was enjoying so much. He said, well, if the Saudis want a Palestinian state, they have a lot of land. Let's build one in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis put out a statement denouncing him. They asked all the Arab states to put out statements denouncing him. And then on their television channel in the evening news, there was a segment about how evil Netanyahu and his family are, which is something I don't recall seeing in Saudi media. So this is not very good for the prospect of normalization, but at the same time, I will caution myself and say that with the amounts of money and weapons involved here, anything can happen. I mean, this is not only about shiny ideals. There's another component that needs to be taken into consideration, which is the Senate in Washington. If MBS actually wants a formal defense treaty with the United States...
Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah, Mohammed bin Salman. Yeah, Mohammed. If he wants a formal defense treaty with the United States, this has to be ratified by the Senate in America with a 2/3 majority. The Republicans today have 53 seats. There is one Republican who could likely vote against it, Rand Paul, who is isolationist. So let's say you start with the 52. You need 15 Democrats to support it. Not an easy thing in today's Washington, which is extremely polarized. And the Democrats are using every little bit of leverage they have, and they don't have a lot, to try to obstruct the Trump agenda. Will you have 15 Democrats to support this Trump-MBS-Bibi deal? Like, think about who are the 3 people that Democrats in America hate the most in the world, okay? So Elon Musk is not on this deal. He's number 4, but it's like Trump, Bibi, MBS. It's like they're, would they support it if the Palestinians get completely rolled over? I don't know. I don't know if you can find 15 Democrats. So all of this is a very complicated situation.